You wouldn't think a mushroom could make someone terrifying. But I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'll tell you about warriors who ate red-capped fungi, howled like wolves, and ran into battle convinced they were bears. Sometimes history gets weird, but this is one of the weirder ones. Amanita muscaria. It's not your average mushroom, vivid red speckled white and famous for inducing everything from euphoria to total meltdown. But centuries ago, Norse warriors known as berserkers may have deliberately consumed these fungi before charging into battle. Why? That's what we're about to explore. The mushrooms, the madness, the mythology intertwined like antlers in combat. If you're into sleepy stories where mushrooms change the course of history, quietly press like and maybe subscribe. I whisper about wild facts like these every week. Also, if you're listening with one eye open and your brain full of Viking trivia, drop a comment. What time is it, and what ancient habit do you think we really misunderstood? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of a Nordic pine forest. Cold air curls through the trees. In the distance, a group of warriors stand in a loose circle, eyes-wide chests bare breathing like bellows. One tilts his head back and chews something bright red and warty. It's not food, it's not medicine, it's Amanita muscaria. This is the Viking berserker, not the cartoonish growling brute, but a man deeply entangled in ritual, myth, and perhaps something chemical. Their names come down to us in sagas, men who fought with terrifying fury, who felt no pain, who seemed more beast than human. The name itself, berserker, has sparked debates for centuries. Was it bear shirt indicating they wore bear pelts, or bear shirt meaning they charged into battle half naked and fearless? The confusion is fitting for such an enigmatic figure. Now add a mushroom into the mix. Amanita muscaria isn't like psilocybin, the more famous magic mushroom. Its effects are far less predictable. Hallucinations, hyperactivity, distorted perception, muscle spasms, and in high doses delirium. Some accounts suggest it was dried, then eaten, or filtered through reindeer urine to mellow its potency. Vikings, it seems, may have been dosing themselves just before battle, not for fun, but to become something else. Historical references to berserkers describe them foaming at the mouth, biting shields, and charging without fear. But did the mushroom cause this state? Or was it a layer on top of intense psychological conditioning, ritual, and belief? Scholars are divided. Some point to similarities with shamanic practices in Siberia, where the same mushroom was used in religious ceremonies. Others suggest it's more folklore than fact, a poetic explanation for battle frenzy. Still, there's something oddly credible about the image a warrior altered in mind stepping outside himself and into a mythic persona. After all, in the Norse world, the line between man and animal, human and god, was fluid. Odin himself practiced Seder, a kind of magic that blurred identity. Why not a mushroom that makes you believe you're invincible? Of course not all agree. Some historians argue that the connection between berserkers and Amanita muscaria was retrofitted by modern writers, that no solid Viking text ever spells it out, that what we're seeing is a hallucination of history itself. But others insist too many signs point towards something psychedelic. So, what do you see fact fantasy or fermented fungi? The idea of mushroom-fueled warriors might sound bizarre, but it's not uniquely Viking. Our trail now shifts eastward across frozen rivers and into the windswept plains of Siberia, where red-capped fungi were not tools of war, but bridges to the spirit world. You walk across a snowy clearing. A reindeer snorts quietly nearby, nibbling something beneath the snow. It noses past lichen and frost and finds what it's looking for. Amanita muscaria, red and ghostly under the white. It eats, pauses, and begins to stagger, strangely calm, then oddly jumpy. For the indigenous peoples of Siberia, this moment was more than nature. It was sacred. Long before Viking berserkers, Siberian shamans were already consuming these mushrooms in ritual contexts. Tribes like the Chukchi Koryak and Evenki used Amanita muscaria to enter trance states to communicate with spirits and to travel metaphysically, at least beyond the bounds of ordinary time. The rituals were precise, inherited, and deeply respected. These weren't casual trips, they were spiritual voyages undertaken with care. And then, of course, there were the reindeer. Yes, reindeer seem to enjoy the mushrooms too. Not just enjoy, they seek them out. After eating, they prance, oddly roll in snow, or appear mesmerized. Some accounts suggest Siberian people observed this behavior and realized whatever altered the reindeer might do the same to humans. The idea of drinking reindeer urine, yes, that's a real thing, came from the observation that the psychoactive compounds in the mushroom could survive digestion, while the toxic ones were filtered out. The result? A milder second-hand high. So, what does this have to do with Vikings? It's here that things get fuzzy. Some researchers believe that cultural diffusion, the spread of ideas, symbols, and rituals, might explain the Viking connection to these mushrooms. Trade routes crisscrossed Eurasia. Furs moved west, metals moved east, and with them, stories. Travelers from the Nordic world could have encountered Siberian rituals and brought home not just goods, but beliefs. Others remained skeptical. The Norse had their own worldview, their own gods, their own ways of invoking the divine. Maybe they didn't borrow so much as arrive at similar practices independently. After all, mushrooms grow in Scandinavia too. You don't need to import something your forest already grows. Still, the overlap is tantalizing. Imagine a Viking chieftain curious about distant customs, hearing tales of the shaman who rode spirits. A young warrior trying a local fungus to steal his nerves. A skald weaving strange visions into verse. Whether by inspiration or coincidence, the line between Norse berserkers and Siberian mystics is thin and slippery. What we know for sure is that both cultures treated Amanita muscaria as more than a mushroom. It was a key to somewhere. Perhaps rage. Perhaps revelation. Of course, the academic debate continues. Some argue the similarities are coincidence, not cause. Others suspect the Vikings were spiritual magpies collecting shiny ideas from every shore they raided. But, whether borrowed or homegrown, the mushroom remained, quiet red and waiting in the woods. Let's step closer to the firelight now, where shadows flicker and voices chant under breath. Before the clash of swords, before the roar of battle, there were rituals. Not just prayers or weapons drills, but full-body transformations that blended fear, belief, and perhaps a bit of mushroom-fueled madness. Picture this, a longhouse filled with warriors. The air is thick with smoke and sweat. Some men pace, others sit in trance. A rhythmic chant builds low hypnotic, like the beat of a slow drum. One man strips off his cloak, then his shirt. He's not just undressing, he's shedding humanity, becoming something else. That's what the sagas whisper about Viking pre-battle ceremonies. These weren't orderly affairs. Some sources speak of frenzied dancing. Others suggest blood sacrifices, goats, or even humans. There are tales of nudity biting howling and convulsions, all signs that something deeper than training was taking place, something that blurred the lines between performance and possession. And always somewhere in the fog of detail is the question of mushrooms. Several poetic Eddas and later sagas describe states that resemble psychedelic experience, visionary rage, disconnection from pain, seeing spirits, ancestors, or gods. But they never spell it out. No Viking text says, "And then Bjorn ate a mushroom and lost his mind." The evidence, such as it is, lies in inference in what's not said plainly, but hinted. Take the Ynglinga saga, for instance. It mentions warriors who become immune to fire and iron, whose strength grows like that of bears or bulls. That's not a combat style. That's a transformation. Whether metaphorical or literal remains debated. Some scholars argue that these rituals were entirely psychological, controlled ways to enter a battle mindset. But others note how similar they are to known psychoactive ceremonies across cultures. The pacing, the heat, the altered behaviors, it fits the profile. One theory even suggests that the berserker's trance wasn't just theater, but a chemically induced state sharpened by belief and performance. It's also possible that the ritual and the drug were inseparable, that the mushrooms weren't taken to fight, but to reach the ritual state that allowed one to fight. Like shamans needing trance to speak to spirits, these warriors may have needed madness to meet their gods or their enemies. And the fear these rituals inspired. It was part of the point. Imagine being an Anglo-Saxon soldier, seeing a Viking warband across the field. Most look ordinary, but a few bare-chested eyes, wild blood painted on skin, are shrieking, biting shields or dancing. You don't see men, you see demons. That kind of performance, real or staged, has power. But was it really mushrooms? That's where the scholarly arguments loop again. Some say yes, the rituals relied on Amanita muscaria. Others suggest alcohol or psychological conditioning or plain bravado. Still others believe the tales were exaggerated by Christian monks trying to make pagan rituals seem savage. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Before Vikings raised their axes, they raised their pulse, their beliefs, and perhaps a mushroom to the gods. The word berserker sounds straightforward until you try to define it. Was it a job title, a spiritual state? A fashion choice involving questionable tailoring? The deeper you look, the blurrier it gets. But behind the shouting and shield-biting lies a puzzle of language mythology and cultural misinterpretation. You sit now beside an old Icelandic manuscript. The ink is faded, the letters tight and spidery. The word in question, berserker, appears again and again, but always in shifting contexts. Sometimes it describes a single warrior, other times an entire class of fighters. But even more intriguing is the word's root. Scholars have long debated whether berserker means bare shirt or bare shirt. It's not just a linguistic squabble, it's a window into how Vikings saw identity. If it's bare shirt, then the idea is that these warriors wore bear pelts perhaps as symbols of strength or even to channel the animal's spirit. But if it's bare shirt, then we're talking about men who fought shirtless, exposing their skin as both a challenge and a declaration of fearlessness. Or, possibly as some have suggested, both interpretations are correct, and that's where the magic lies. In Norse culture, symbolism and reality often swam together. Bears were more than animals. They were mythic figures connected to deities like Odin and Thor. To don a bear pelt was not merely costume, it was transformation. You weren't wearing a bear. You were becoming one. But what if it wasn't a pelt at all? Some texts hint that berserkers might have simply stripped down. No shirts, no armor, just flesh adrenaline and maybe a red mushroom or two. It's a strange blend of vulnerability and terror. Imagine facing someone who looks half naked but utterly unafraid. That alone could unnerve any opponent. The confusion is deepened by saga descriptions. In one, a berserker is said to swell with fury until he becomes unrecognizable. In another, he is immune to pain, slashing wildly until exhaustion takes him. Are these literal accounts, metaphors, doses of dramatic flair? Historians disagree. Some argue that berserker was never a formal category, just a nickname for particularly wild fighters. Others believe it was a defined role, perhaps even organized within warbands. Still others point to later medieval writers who reimagine these warriors as monsters or madmen, distorting the original meanings. Folklore adds another twist. Later, Icelandic tales describe berserkers who duel for women, go into uncontrollable rages, or must be calmed with spells. These stories often portray them as tragic figures, powerful, but doomed. It's here the line between warrior and outcast begins to blur. Even the Christian scribes who recorded many of these stories seemed unsure. Some treated berserkers as cursed men, others as awe-inspiring heroes. That duality, fear and admiration, echoes across the centuries. In the end, defining a berserker might miss the point. They weren't just shirtless brutes or men in bear suits. They were living contradictions, human and animal sacred, and savage feared and revered. And perhaps that ambiguity was their greatest power of all. Let's turn our gaze now from myth and wordplay to something more tangible: your nervous system. Because whether berserkers were in bear shirts or no shirts at all, one question remains: could a mushroom really turn someone into a superhuman fighter? Or just a frothing mess? You crouch beside a cluster of Amanita muscaria mushrooms, their ruby-red caps flecked with white like spilled milk on lacquer. At first glance, they look almost toy-like, but hidden beneath that fairy tale exterior lies a strange cocktail of neurotoxins. And these compounds don't just tingle the brain, they take it on a ride. Amanita muscaria contains muscimol and ibotenic acid. Unlike psilocybin, which tends to induce visual hallucinations and introspection, these chemicals interact with GABA receptors in the brain, potentially causing drowsiness, confusion, muscle twitching, euphoria, and sometimes violent behavior. But the effects vary wildly from person to person and dose to dose. Which brings us to the berserker question. Could these mushrooms cause the famed rage, the battle trance, the inhuman strength? Some scientists think so. High doses of muscimol have been linked to episodes of heightened aggression and lowered pain perception. Combined with ritual chanting and extreme stress, a person might very well feel invincible or disconnected enough from pain and fear to act invincible. Not superhuman exactly, but unhinged enough to seem that way. But there's a catch. The same compounds can also cause paralysis, vomiting, or complete incoherence. Some people hallucinate vividly. Others just fall asleep. The line between frenzied warrior and twitching mess is thin and possibly dependent on preparation. Drying the mushroom reduces ibotenic acid and enhances muscimol, which may soften the experience. Siberian shamans knew this. Did Vikings. That's where the trail gets patchy. There's no definitive archaeological evidence, no Viking mushroom kits, no leftover dried caps in graves. But saga descriptions of uncontrollable fury, imperviousness to injury, and even seizure-like behavior have led some researchers to suggest that Amanita muscaria was used because of its unpredictability. To break free from the human frame, you needed to risk falling apart. Still, not everyone buys it. Skeptics argue that the berserker state could be achieved through pure psychological conditioning, rituals, fasting, and adrenaline. Others say alcohol or extreme emotional triggers, grief, vengeance, peer pressure could induce similar results. The mushroom theory, they warn, may be more projection than history. Even modern studies of combat rage show that the human brain can shut down fear and pain under stress. With enough belief and social pressure, people have done astonishing things without the help of any fungus. So, maybe the berserkers needed no chemical edge. Maybe they simply believed hard enough. But then again, humans have a long history of using plants to transcend themselves. From Amazonian ayahuasca to Greek kaikisen, sacred potions have often walked the line between ritual and reality. It's entirely possible the Vikings had their own version, rooted not in faith alone, but fungi. In the end, the question lingers like mushroom spores on a forest breeze: were the berserkers empowered or poisoned? As the wind brushes through the pine branches, picture a man draped in fur, Not just for warmth, but transformation. Animal skins were more than clothing in the Viking world. They were talismans, disguises, and perhaps even catalysts for becoming someone or something else. The berserkers and their kin, often referred to in texts as Ulfhednar or wolf coats, weren't just warriors. They were shapeshifters in spirit, possibly in ritual, and maybe even in hallucination. They donned the pelts of wolves or bears before charging into battle, believing, or at least pretending, that the animal's power entered them through the skin. In many cultures, this idea of becoming another being isn't metaphor. It's performance spirituality and psychodrama all rolled into one. For the Norse, to wear the hide of a bear wasn't to imitate it was to invite it, to channel its strength, its fearlessness, its untamed rage. And when you're wrapped in fur, chanting blood-soaked and possibly high on mushrooms, who's to say where identity ends? The animal transformation goes deeper than mere costuming. Norse mythology is filled with liminal figures, beings caught between shapes. Odin takes the form of an eagle, a snake, even a woman. Loki transforms into a mare. Werewolves roam the old tales not always as monsters, but as cursed or sacred creatures. Identity in the Viking mind was never fixed. The gods blurred it. The warriors lived it. Some scholars suggest the animal garb served a psychological function. Wearing a bear pelt might not actually make you stronger, but it might make you feel stronger. And that belief in turn affects behavior. Confidence rises, fear diminishes, pain tolerance increases. A kind of placebo armor woven in fur. Others argue the practice had religious roots. Certain rituals may have called on animal spirits, real or imagined, to aid in battle. Some suggest the pelt was worn during trance ceremonies or cedar magic, and only later adopted in combat. There's no scholarly consensus on whether the animal transformation was theatrical, spiritual, pharmacological, or all three. Interestingly, some later medieval writers began describing berserkers as cursed, not warriors blessed by animal power, but victims of it, men lost to madness, turned into beasts against their will. It's possible that as Christian influence grew, the animal skin rituals became demonized. What was once sacred became sinful. What was once transformation became possession. But in the Viking Age, these skins carried layered meanings. A bear pelt could be a badge of honor or a mask for rage. A wolf skin could mark a hunter or a man on the edge of losing his humanity. Modern reenactments often reduce it to cosplay fur capes and growling, but back then it was something else entirely. A pelt was a portal, to power, to madness, or maybe just to survival. And so, you're left wondering, was the fur worn to scare others, or to forget yourself? Now the mist thickens and we step sideways into the world of Viking magic. Not sleight of hand or fairy tale curses, but cedar, a potent blend of prophecy, ritual, and influence. And nestled quietly within its shadowy practices may lie a curious truth. Mushrooms weren't just for berserkers. Cider practiced by seers called volur or sidekonur was a mystical tradition often associated with Odin, but mostly performed by women. It involved chanting staff-wielding trance states and visions. The goal, to see what others could not, fate's omens or hidden knowledge, and perhaps to shape outcomes in battle or life. But achieving trance wasn't a casual affair. Some historians argue that Seder involved psychoactive substances including, yes, Amanita muscaria. There are no direct recipes, of course, no Viking version of mushrooms for dummies. But subtle clues in the sagas describe the seeress as entering otherworldly states, sometimes with convulsions, visions, or utterances not her own. The rituals often took place on platforms or in liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds. These details sound suspiciously like the behaviors seen in cultures that use psychedelics for spiritual practice. And the connection doesn't end there. Berserkers and magic practitioners may have shared more than fungi. In some sagas, a warrior's madness is described in near magical terms. In others, a seeress guides the warriors or chants over them before battle. The boundaries blur. Was the rage magical? Was the magic enraged? Interestingly, satyr was not universally admired. For men performing it was considered ergy, unmanly, deviant. Even Odin, who practiced it, was mocked for doing something womanly. Yet its power was undeniable. A skilled practitioner could paralyze enemies, uncover secrets, or change a king's fate. This blend of awe and discomfort mirrors how berserkers were seen, feared, admired, and slightly cursed. So, what happens when these two traditions intersect? Some theories propose that satyr magic and berserker rage shared a root in altered states, different expressions of the same trance. A vulva used mushrooms to see, a berserker to lose himself in war. Two sides of the same enchanted coin. Perhaps a woman's trance was internal prophetic, and a man's external destructive. Or maybe in rare cases the roles overlapped. The sagas are filled with contradictions. Men who speak prophecy in battle, women who fight like animals. If mushrooms were part of the spiritual toolkit, they may have enabled both madness and magic, depending on the ritual and the ritualist. Some researchers even suggest that berserkers were the muscle for magical rites shield biters who could be summoned or directed by the seeress. A terrifying thought, not just a raging warrior, but one enchanted, guided by a quiet voice in a darkened hall. The scholarly debate remains lively. Some dismiss the magic mushroom link as speculative nonsense. Others point to ethnographic parallels around the world and argue it's simply been overlooked. But if you follow the whispers, the smoke, and the soft chanting behind the hall's curtain, the connection becomes hard to ignore. Maybe the Viking world wasn't just warriors and raiders. Maybe it was spells and spores. Drift now to the edges of the Viking world, not to their homes, but to the terrified imaginations of their enemies. For as much as berserkers are shrouded in Norse mystery, much of their legend comes from how others saw them, and those others were horrified. Picture a quiet Frankish village in the 9th century. Church bells ring and farmers pull in their livestock. Then comes the sound longboat scraping against the riverbank shouts in an alien tongue and the thunder of charging feet. Some of those feet belong to berserkers, bare-chested, eyes glazed, covered in furs and possibly foam. To a Christian monk observing from a distance, this wasn't bravery, it was blasphemy. Anglo-Saxon chronicles speak of Viking warriors who seemed immune to pain, striking down foes while pierced by spears. In one account, a berserker is said to fight with such fury that even after being mortally wounded, he continues killing until his body collapses. Another tale describes warriors biting into their shields until blood runs down their chins. It sounds less like history, more like a horror story. And that's the point. The berserker's true weapon may have been fear. Their fury, whether real or ritualized, unnerved more organized armies. Roman-style ranks and discipline falter when faced with chaos. A berserker, unpredictable and wild, could break formations by sheer presence. Whether or not he was chemically enhanced hardly mattered. His performance did the job. This fear wasn't accidental. Many scholars believe the berserker mythos was deliberately cultivated. Stories were allowed to spread, exaggerated even. After all, if you could convince an enemy that you were possessed, unstoppable, and half-beast, wouldn't you? Even Viking poets contributed to this image. Skaldic verses describe berserkers as Odin's chosen, fighting with divine madness. But those same verses might have played double duty, glorifying the warriors for Norse audiences and terrifying foreign ones. Some historians suspect that berserkers weren't always present on raids, but their legend traveled farther than they did. like psychological warfare echoing across coastlines. Even if no actual mushroom-chewing warrior stormed your town, the idea that he might was enough to rattle nerves. Still, it's hard to separate myth from method. Were berserkers truly different in battle? Did their fury make them more effective or just more memorable? There's no clear consensus. Some suggest their tactics were suicidal, others that they served as shock troops breaking the enemy before the main army advanced. A few believe berserkers were just talented fighters with a flair for showmanship and very good publicists. But consider this centuries later, long after the Viking Age faded, European writers still reference berserkers. They became symbols of chaos, madness, and primal rage enduring long past their historical moment. That kind of cultural staying power doesn't come from average warriors. So maybe what frightened the world most wasn't just the axe or the mushroom. It was the glimpse of a person willingly losing themselves to something darker, something ancient, something they called the Berserker Gang, and no one else could quite explain. As the Viking world expanded, so did its contradictions. These were people who worshipped gods of both poetry and war, who prized honor, yet reveled in chaos. And no figure embodies that contradiction more than the berserker so admired in battle, yet so feared at home. Because eventually, even Viking societies began to say enough. You walk now through the crisp air of medieval Iceland. The land is quiet wind sweeping over mossy hills and wooden homesteads. Inside the local thing, illegal assembly elders debate a troubling issue: what to do about the berserkers. Not as heroes, but as criminals. Yes, berserkers were outlawed. By the 10th century, Norse law codes, especially in Iceland, began to restrict or even ban berserker behavior. One of the earliest mentions appears in Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law book. There, berserkers are referred to, not with awe, but with concern. Their wild rages weren't seen as noble, they were dangerous, unpredictable, and disruptive to society. In some versions of the law, going berserk in public without cause was punishable by exile or even death. So, what changed part of the answer may lie in the transition from clan-based raiding to more structured settlement life. In a raid, a berserker might be useful. But back home, his uncontrollable temper posed a threat. A man who bit shields and howled could no longer be romanticized once he was tearing through a neighbor's goat pen or challenging someone at a wedding feast. And then there's the cultural shift. As Norse societies evolved, and especially as Christianity gained influence, the value placed on spiritual frenzy began to erode. What was once divine rage became seen as madness. The rituals once used to summon strength began to resemble disorder. And the berserker once lionized was gradually painted as unstable. Yet, even as they were legally condemned, they remained culturally fascinating. Some sagas describe them as relics of a wilder past. Others cast them as tragic anti-heroes, strong but doomed, necessary but flawed. One tale might show a berserker saving a village from invaders. Another might end with that same warrior being banished for a drunken outburst. It's this ambiguity that gives the legal record such texture. The laws don't erase the berserker, they regulate him. Like a barely tamed fire, he's allowed in the hearth, but not in the barn. And that tension says more about Viking values than any single saga. Historians continue to debate the legal shift. Some argue it reflects growing Christian morality, placing self-control above passion. Others think it was purely practical. You can't run a stable farming society with rage monsters roaming the countryside, no matter how poetic their battle might be. But the fact that berserkers needed legal curbing tells us something important. They were real enough to be a problem, not just myth, not just metaphor, flesh and blood, and sometimes mushrooms. So now we ask, were berserkers forced into extinction by faith and law? Or did they vanish because the world they needed, the world of chaos, fire, and war, began to vanish too? Step now into a dim hall of symbols, carved not with words, but with lines. Here history speaks in stone, not saga. Viking art is cryptic, abstract, and often mystical, and somewhere within these swirling patterns and animal forms, some researchers claim to see mushrooms. You trace your fingers across a runestone. Its surface is cold and rough, its grooves worn by centuries. Amid twisting serpents and interlaced geometry, something odd stands out, a cluster of shapes, round caps, dotted patterns, long stems. Could they be Amanita muscaria, or is your sleep-deprived mind playing tricks? That question haunts modern scholars. Viking visual art wasn't literal. It danced between realism and abstraction. But a few carvings, especially on rune stones and wood panels, seem to echo the shape of mushrooms. Not generic fungi, but the distinct iconic look of amanita red caps, with white specks often surrounded by curling lines that evoke trance or transformation. In one carving, a figure seems to be kneeling under a tree-like form whose branches look suspiciously like fungal caps. In another, tiny circles float above a warrior's head, as if signaling altered perception. Are these mushrooms, spirit portals, just dots? It's maddening and deeply intriguing. Proponents argue that Viking artists subtly encoded hallucinogenic imagery into sacred objects, that mushrooms being tied to ritual and battle had a visual language all their own, hidden in plain sight. Some even claim that the symmetrical looping patterns common in Viking art mimic the fractal-like visuals reported during psychedelic experiences. But skeptics push back hard. They argue that these patterns predate any evidence of mushroom use in Norse culture, that the shapes are stylistic, not symbolic, that seeing mushrooms in Viking art says more about 21st century obsessions than 10th century beliefs. After all, pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaning in randomness, is a powerful trickster. Still, there's historical precedent for visual secrecy. Cultures across the globe have used encoded art to depict taboo or sacred themes, from medieval bestiaries hiding political satire to Mesoamerican murals laced with drug imagery. Art has always spoken in whispers. It wouldn't be unusual for Viking carvers to do the same, especially if the mushrooms were linked to mystical rites. Another tantalizing clue lies in the repetition of tree and plant motifs in Norse art. The Yggdrasil, or world tree, connects the 9 realms of Norse cosmology. Some researchers propose that certain depictions of the tree, especially with roots and branches curved like caps and stems, might double as veiled references to mushrooms as world-bridging agents. And remember, Amanita muscaria was associated with Siberian cosmology too, where it was seen as a ladder between earth and sky. Did those ideas bleed westward? Did Norse carvers borrow, blend, or just dream in similar shapes? There's no scholarly consensus. Some see symbols, others see coincidence. The evidence is as slippery as snow on stone. But when you look closely at Viking carvings, especially after hearing the old tales, you might start to wonder, were those just loops and lines, or maps to altered minds? As the church bells began to toll across the north, something in the Viking soul began to quiet. Christianity didn't arrive in Scandinavia all at once, but when it came, it brought order, scripture, and new codes of behavior. And with that, the berserkers, those roaring figures of rage and ritual, slowly faded from the scene. You stand in a newly built wooden church in Norway. The beams smell of fresh pine. Outside, the old gods still whisper in the forests. Inside, a monk chants in Latin. A warrior kneels not to Odin, but to Christ. And in this new order, there's no room for mushrooms or madness. Christianization swept through Scandinavia between the 9th and 12th centuries, slowly transforming pagan societies into Christian kingdoms. Kings converted first often for political advantage. But with them came laws, clergy, and doctrine. The ecstatic chaos of berserkers clashed hard with the discipline of the church. Suddenly, frenzied rituals looked like demonic possession. Animal transformations sounded like heresy, and trance states dangerous superstition. Clerical texts from the period are filled with scorn for pagan madness. Some churchmen warned of men raging like beasts and labeled berserkers as agents of the devil. The very traits once admired, fearlessness, rage, spiritual possession, were rebranded as sinful, shameful, or even criminal. And it wasn't just ideology. With Christianity came a legal framework that further suppressed old practices. The berserker laws we saw earlier, those banning unprovoked rages or duels, fit neatly into a wider Christian project, replacing tribal honor with state control. Now, violence was no longer sacred. It was just illegal. Magic, too, fell under suspicion. Cider, once used to see fate or summon protection, became witchcraft in the eyes of the church. The vulvas faded, and with them, perhaps the quiet mushroom rituals they may have preserved. So, what happened to the berserkers? Some tried to adapt. Warriors joined Christian armies, trading furs for crosses and battle cries for hymns. Others disappeared from the wrecker, possibly absorbed into folklore, where they lingered as fairy tale villains, tragic beasts, or cautionary tales. A few resisted holding on to the old ways in secret, but the momentum was against them. Interestingly, some sagas from the Christian period romanticize berserkers, portraying them as relics of a noble lost age. In one tale, a Christian hero must defeat a berserker as a trial, suggesting that by then the berserker was a symbol of the wild past, not the present. A challenge to be overcome, not imitated. Historians continue to debate the timeline. Did berserkers vanish naturally as warfare changed, or were they actively stamped out by priests and kings? Some suggest that the decline was both cultural and pharmacological ritual, mushroom use fading as Christian norms spread. Whatever the reason, by the time Viking helmets were gathering dust in churches, the berserker was gone, not slain in battle, but exiled by theology. And in his place, a quieter warrior, one who knelt, prayed, and never bit his shield. Now, we return to the fire-lit halls of Iceland, where the old sagas still sing. Though the berserkers may have vanished from daily life, they lived on in story, louder, stranger, and sometimes more haunting than ever. But how much of what we read was real, and how much was literary embroidery? You lean over a worn vellum page. Ink dances in long loops. The saga tells of a man with iron skin, unstoppable in battle, who cannot be wounded until he falls asleep. Another speaks of a warrior who kills 12 men in a frenzy, then collapses into a heap and sleeps for days. These are berserkers, but are they history or metaphor? The Icelandic sagas, written mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, are among the richest sources for Viking stories. But they were penned long after the Viking Age ended by Christian scribes with Christian morals and often with a taste for drama. That makes them both invaluable and deeply complicated. Berserkers appear frequently in these tales, sometimes as heroes, more often as villains or obstacles. They're strong, temperamental, prone to duels. In Egil's saga, one berserker is killed with clever trickery. In Grettir's saga, another is haunted by his own violence. These men are rarely sympathetic. Their challenges to be overcome, not models to emulate. Yet their traits, shield-biting trance-like strength, animalistic fury, echo consistently across stories. That consistency suggests they were based on something real, even if distorted by time. One of the most famous descriptions comes from Hrolf Kraki's saga, where berserkers are described as howling, foaming, and invulnerable until their rage wears off, leaving them weak as kittens. This berserker rage cycle frenzy, followed by collapse, feels oddly physiological. Could it be an exaggerated version of mushroom-induced behavior? Some think so. Others argue that the sagas are best read as myth-making, using the berserker archetype as a cautionary tale. They represent unbalanced masculinity strength without reason, passion without discipline. By defeating them, saga heroes prove not just their power, but their self-control. The Christian scribes may have leaned into this angle. They preserved the berserker myth, but reframed it. Instead of glorious warriors, berserkers became unruly relics of a pagan past, dramatic, dangerous, and ultimately doomed. Still, not all portrayals are negative. Some berserkers are shown with honor, especially when fighting for kings or protecting kin. It's a spectrum from monstrous to noble, from wild to wise. And in that ambiguity, we catch a glimpse of how complex these figures really were. Modern scholars remain divided. Some treat saga accounts as fantasy. Others believe they preserve oral traditions rooted in truth, warped but not invented. Either way, they offer a unique lens into how the Norse themselves remembered berserkers through the soft glow of story. So, next time you read about a warrior with a red face, bulging eyes, and a taste for shields, pause and wonder, was this a man, a mushroom vision, or a memory stitched into legend? The story of the mushroom doesn't end in the forest. Even after the Viking Age faded and berserkers disappeared from battlefields, Amanita muscaria found a second life not as a weapon, but as a medicine. Welcome to the quieter, dustier halls of medieval herbalism, where fungi sat alongside nettles, leeches, and hope. You peer into a manuscript of medieval cures. The parchment smells faintly of herbs and smoke. Inked beside drawings of eyeballs and gouty toes is a curious red-capped fungus. It's labeled as dangerous, yes, but also as useful. This is Amanita muscaria stepping out of Viking frenzy and into the doctor's toolkit. By the late Middle Ages, Amanita muscaria was known throughout Europe. It was rarely embraced, but it was noted. Herbalists warned of its dangers, nausea, delirium, death. But some believed that in tiny, carefully prepared doses, it had value. A little bit of madness, it turns out, might just ease the aches of the body. Some early texts suggest Amanita was used to treat gout, fatigue, and even melancholy. A strange irony, the same mushroom that once stirred war rage might now have soothed aching knees or cloudy minds. The dosage was key, and the preparation method secretive. Dried, boiled, or filtered through complex processes, most likely learned through observation or trial and error. One notable reference appears in the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and polymath. While she doesn't mention Amanita by name, she warns against the red and white spotted mushroom, describing it as harmful unless handled properly. Her words carry both fear and curiosity. But medical use was always limited and controversial. Amanita never entered the herbal canon the way chamomile or willow bark did. It remained on the fringes its power, too unpredictable, its risks too great. Still it lingered, passed down in obscure recipes, written into marginal notes, whispered about by folk healers who worked outside the gaze of the church. Some modern researchers speculate that certain regional traditions, especially in Eastern Europe, retained knowledge of how to prepare Amanita for medicinal use long after it vanished from mainstream texts. Stories of peasants using fly agaric tea to fight fatigue or ward off bad spirits echo these possibilities. Even the name fly agaric reflects a strange legacy. In parts of Europe dried, Amanita was placed in milk to poison flies. It worked, and the name stuck. A mushroom once tied to divine rage reduced to a fly trap on a windowsill. Historians debate whether medieval healers truly understood the mushroom's chemistry, or simply noticed patterns: eat too much, you get sick; eat a little, maybe you sleep better. There is no scholarly consensus on how widely Amanita was used, or whether its medical reputation was earned or inherited. Still, its journey from battlefield to bedside is a curious one. What once summoned spirits and fury now sat dry, fragile, and misunderstood on a healer's shelf. No longer a warrior's ally, just another tool. Mysterious, feared, and quietly waiting in the dark. And still, the legend refuses to die. Long after the berserkers vanished from laws, stories, and medicine, they reappeared strangely modern, almost cartoonish. From video games to heavy metal albums, the red-eyed Viking warrior howling with rage stomps through popular culture. But how do we go from mushroom-chomping mystics to button-mashing avatars? You stare at a flickering screen. A character roars, muscles, rippling eyes glowing. The word berserk mode flashes above him in jagged letters. Suddenly he's faster, stronger, unstoppable for 30 seconds. Then the rage wears off and the screen resets. This is the berserker now, a video game power-up. It didn't start that way. In the 19th century, romantic poets and nationalist historians rediscovered the Norse sagas. They loved the rawness, the drama, the idea of ancient warriors driven by passion and fate. Berserkers became symbols of primal masculinity, fearless, tragic, misunderstood. The mushroom part largely forgotten. Then came the 20th century. As fantasy literature blossomed, berserkers found a new home. Writers like Tolkien, who mined Norse myth for inspiration, shaped the idea of the raging warrior. Tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons introduced berserker classes strong, chaotic, with low defense but massive offense. They were simplified, gamified, mythicized. And by the time video games joined the fray, the berserker was a staple. Modern portrayals often drop the spiritual and psychological aspects. The bare shirts are now shoulder armor. The mushrooms, if mentioned at all, become comic relief or exotic loot. Rage is a game mechanic, not a trance state. The rich ambiguity of the historical figure flattens into a stereotype angry Viking hits things. Yet even this simplified version holds echoes of the past. In certain games and films, you'll still see characters who enter frenzied states, who take strange potions, who fight with animalistic abandon. Some designers have admitted drawing inspiration from Old Norse texts, even if loosely. The aura of the berserker still lingers, wild, misunderstood, and powerful. Meanwhile, reenactment groups and Viking festivals occasionally revive the more mystical side. Some wear furs and chant. Others experiment carefully with ritual mushrooms, trying to understand what a trance might have felt like. Whether it's historical or theatrical hardly matters. The berserker continues to inspire a kind of awe. Academics watch all this with cautious amusement. Some worry that pop culture distorts history. Others see it as part of the myth's ongoing life. After all, stories evolve. Maybe the berserker is a power-up now, but one with roots deeper than we realize. And it's not just entertainment. Psychologists have explored berserker rage as a metaphor for dissociation during combat. Military trainers sometimes reference it when discussing adrenaline states. The concept, even stripped of its original context, still offers language for the extremes of human behavior. So, while the mushroom-chewing warrior may no longer haunt forests or raid coasts, his legend keeps shifting, molting, surviving. Maybe that's what berserkers did best, not rage, but adapt. From furs to pixels, from myth to metaphor. Still wild, still misunderstood, still here. So, we arrive at the edge of the known, where the sagas thin, the mushroom trails vanish, and history slips into silence. After all the theories, carvings, rituals, and reboots, one question refuses to go away. What do we really know about Viking hallucinogens? The honest answer, less than we'd like. And maybe that's fitting. You sit on a mossy stone in the woods, the kind of place where a red-capped mushroom might appear. You've read the sagas pored over runes, listened to scholars debate dosage and trance, but no first-hand account remains. No Viking wrote, "I ate this and became a wolf." We're left with impressions, not instructions. Murmurs, not manifestos. That silence has opened the door for speculation. Some researchers argue that the entire mushroom theory is built on modern bias. Our obsession with psychedelics coloring how we read ancient texts. Maybe the berserkers were just angry men in fur amped up on adrenaline and cultic fervor. Maybe there were no mushrooms at all. Others point to the consistencies, the seizures, the foaming, the altered states. The parallels with Siberian shamans and other ancient cultures who did use Amanita muscaria, the whispered hints in sagas and the strange recurrence of trance-like behavior. No hard proof, but too much smoke for there to be no fire. Then there are the practicalities. Could the mushrooms have been reliably harvested, prepared safely used in battle without disastrous side effects? The unpredictability of Amanita muscaria makes it a tricky ally. Too much and you're incoherent. Too little and nothing happens. It's not exactly a warrior's best friend, but maybe precision wasn't the point. Maybe the mushroom's power was in its mystery. Its role not as a drug, but as a ritual threshold. A tool for crossing the line from man to beast, from fear to fury. If the Vikings believed it worked, then perhaps it did, because belief, especially when paired with performance and community, is its own kind of pharmacology. Some theories we've traced are compelling, others are charmingly far-fetched. A few may never be proven or disproven, locked forever behind the veil of time. Viking hallucinogens, if they existed, weren't labeled preserved or written down. They left no recipe. Just legend. And perhaps that's why they continue to fascinate. In a world addicted to certainty, the berserker mushroom remains a riddle, part pharmacology, part performance, part poetic invention. It sits at the crossroads of fear and fascination, where warriors become wolves, mushrooms whisper madness, and no one's quite sure what's real. So as the fire dies down and the story unwinds, you're left not with answers but questions. Did the berserkers rage because of a fungus, or because they were human, or both? We may never know. And maybe that's the best ending this tale can have. But even as Viking legends slip into fog, another mist thickens this time over the highlands of Britain. The hallucinatory gives way to the haunting, as warriors shed not only logic, but clothing, cloaking themselves instead in blue. You walk through the chill air of northern Britain, 2nd century CE. The Roman frontier lies behind you, walls camps discipline. But here in this untamed edge, stories grow teeth. Patrols whisper of encounters, eerie fogs, ghostly silhouettes, and warriors covered in blue. The Romans called them pictae, meaning painted ones. It's a name that stuck. Whether the warriors called themselves that is still debated, but to the empire, the label captured their strange and unsettling image. Naked bodies streaked in woad, a blue dye that clung like armor. These weren't illusions, but very real opponents. And they used appearance as much as weaponry. From the perspective of a Roman infantryman trained armored orderly, this was a nightmare. The enemy made no sense. Their tactics defied formation. Their silence was terrifying. And then there was the color, unnatural, dazzling, symbolic. Imagine facing a charge of people who'd stripped away not just clothes, but conventional logic. You don't wear pigment unless you want to send a message. Ancient writers like Tacitus and Dio Cassius describe these encounters, though how much they actually saw is uncertain. Painted blue and naked could just as easily be exaggeration or propaganda. Some historians argue these descriptions played into Roman tropes of the barbarian, wild, irrational, inhuman. Others suggest there's truth behind the surreal. Perhaps they weren't truly naked, just lightly clothed in ways unfamiliar to Roman eyes. Or perhaps, like certain Amazonian warriors or Pacific tribes, they fought with bodies as part of their arsenal costume for impact. Quirkily, some Roman records note not just blue warriors, but painted horses' shields and even pets. A show of unity, or maybe just chaos as a tactic. There's no scholarly consensus on how literally we should take these reports. Some say the blue was symbolic, others believe it was a psychological weapon. The fog, the paint, the nudity. It wasn't just bizarre, it was brilliant. It threw the enemy off balance before a blade was even drawn. And here, with the sound of distant gulls and the snap of heather underfoot, your journey begins, where paint is more than art, and nakedness is its own kind of defiance. The chill of the northern wind bites differently when your only armor is a smear of pigment. But then fear itself can be a weapon sometimes more potent than steel. And the Picts knew how to wield it, not just with blades but with blue. The idea seems ridiculous at first, warriors walking into battle without the protection of leather or mail, but fully adorned in war paint. What kind of strategy is that? The answer possibly is psychological warfare. When an enemy appears half divine, half mad, draped only in the colors of the sky, it destabilizes not just the eye, but the nerve. Roman soldiers, raised in the language of order, columns, shields formations, faced chaos in human form. Pictish warriors, painted head to toe, charged in erratic waves, shrieking war cries smeared in a color so unnatural it jarred the senses. The pigment wasn't camouflage, it was theater, fear theater. Many scholars believe the choice of blue, a color not easily found in nature, outside the sky and sea amplified the shock. It wasn't just visually arresting. It carried connotations of magic danger, otherworldliness. Some accounts even describe the warriors as glowing under certain light, though that might owe more to nervous imaginations than actual luminescence. The pigment itself came from Isatis tinctoria, the woad plant, which needed fermenting in urine to extract its signature dye. The process was messy, smelly, and not for the faint of heart. Yet the final product had staying power. It stained skin for days and resisted wear even in battle. To an outsider, the result was surreal, warriors seemingly dipped in stormlight. There's ongoing debate about whether the blue had medicinal use too. Some researchers argue the woad might have acted as an antiseptic, possibly reducing infection in wounds. Others suspect the fermentation left mild skin irritants causing tingling or heat that warriors could have interpreted as empowering burning, with battle spirit quite literally. Then there's the idea that it wasn't just about scaring the enemy. It was about transforming the self. The moment pigment touched flesh, a person became something else, a vessel for tribe ancestors' gods. Fighting in pigment may have been ritual before it was tactical. The color marked not just warriors, but identities. Quirks abound in old accounts. One tale recounts a commander who hesitated to attack because the enemy's paint reminded him of sacred rites. Another speaks of blue-faced children mimicking warrior dances. The blue was infectious in a way. No one can say for certain what the warriors themselves believed. That's the frustrating beauty of it. The Romans wrote the scripts, but the Picts left few of their own. So we sift through pottery bones and pigments like detectives chasing ghosts through fog. Still one truth lingers: the paint made people pause. It unsettled. It marked a boundary between worldview's order and wildness, Rome, and resistance. Whether used for shock spirit or something in between, it worked. And so, you march a little deeper into blue shadows where fear is pigment and color becomes armor in a battle of minds. The plant looks harmless, modest green leaves, yellow flowers, nothing more than a weed to the untrained eye. But, woad humble though it seems, may have been one of the most potent tools in the Pictish arsenal, not just for color, but for its deeper, stranger effects. To turn a plant into battle paint isn't simple. You'd start by crushing the leaves, drying them, then fermenting the pulp in a stew of water and more unusually urine. This wasn't decorative dyeing like in textiles. The goal was to coax out indigotin, the blue compound that made skin shimmer with an unearthly hue. But the question remains, was the paint more than visual? Some accounts suggest woad may have caused mild intoxication. Applied thickly or inhaled during preparation, it might have created sensations of heat euphoria or agitation, not unlike the berserker trance reported among Norse warriors. Did the blue warriors feel their skin tingle, their hearts race, their senses bend? It's possible. Botanists studying woad have found compounds with antimicrobial effects, but little evidence of psychoactive ingredients. And yet, folklore is persistent. Some oral traditions speak of battle joy or skin heat when woad was rubbed into fresh cuts. Was it myth misinterpretation? Or did something happen that science has yet to explain? There's also the curious problem of dosage. If fermented improperly, the dye could blister the skin. Yet many warriors used it liberally. That hints at either tolerance or intent. Pain, after all, might have been part of the ritual, a way to shed identity and become something else. A blue ghost, a spirit of war. One particularly odd account tells of warriors grinding woad with bone dust or animal fat, perhaps for texture, perhaps for symbolism. These additions could have changed the properties of the paint. Maybe some versions were soothing, others burning. Without written recipes, all we have are guesses, some poetic, others oddly clinical. And then there's the smell. Fermented woad isn't discreet. A mix of rot and sharp acid, it would have announced its wearers long before they were seen. Which begs another question: did the Picts want to be smelled? Perhaps it was part of the intimidation. A strange, pungent fog drifting ahead of battle. Some scholars argue these sensory elements, the sting, the scent, the shimmer, work together. Woad became a full-body transformation. Less about decoration, more about becoming something between man and myth. Others are skeptical, seeing modern fascination with trippy plants as projection. Still, even skeptics agree no other group in the Roman records was so closely associated with a plant. Woad made the Picts memorable, dangerous, different. As you walk the edge of their world, a field of flowering weeds waves lazily in the breeze. But now you know it's no ordinary bloom. It may have stained the skin of warriors, shaped legends, and blurred the line between pigment and power. The question lingers like the scent in the air. Was it just paint, or something stranger? The first time you see a body painted for war, it doesn't feel like history, it feels like theater. But look beyond the Pictish highlands, and you'll find that the blue-painted warrior is hardly unique. Across centuries and continents, people have turned skin into canvas, transforming themselves before stepping into battle. In the jungles of the Amazon, some tribes still coat their bodies in red, black, or white clay before hunts or conflicts. In Papua New Guinea, warriors sculpt intricate headdresses and daub themselves with ochre and ash, creating faces that resemble spirits more than soldiers. Even in ancient India, war dancers performed before battles, their bodies covered in ritual pigment to summon courage and confusion in equal measure. What all these traditions share is the understanding that warfare isn't just physical, it's psychological, symbolic, and often theatrical. To appear otherworldly is to claim power that transcends mere muscle. A painted body becomes a signal. I am not just flesh, I am myth. The meanings behind these pigments vary. Among the Maori facial tattoos, moko were permanent declarations of lineage and valor. For some Native American nations, colors marked roles, rites of passage, or connection to spirits. White could mean death, red vitality, black preparation for war. And across Oceania, face paint often served to blur the line between the living and the ancestral. So, what makes the Picts stand out? Partly it's the reaction they provoked. Roman sources describe them not with anthropological curiosity, but with dread. Their nudity, their pigment, their silence. It wasn't just foreign, it was unclassifiable. And perhaps that's the point. Like other painted warriors, they knew that ambiguity breeds fear. Are they men, spirits, madmen? The hesitation such questions spark is often enough to tip the scales in battle. There's one curious case from ancient China, the Yue people described in early texts as tattooing their faces and going into combat bare-chested. Chinese chroniclers like the Romans wrote about them with suspicion. Painted skin, it seems, defied civilization, too wild, too unpredictable. Yet the pattern repeats across history. When humans prepare for war, they don't always reach for armor. Sometimes they reach for pigment. It's faster than metal, more flexible than cloth, and speaks to something primal. To mark the skin is to declare intent. This is who I am, and I will not blend in. Quirky details pop up, even in unlikely places. In medieval Scotland, some clans reportedly carried face-marking traditions long after the Romans had gone. In Ethiopia, certain warrior groups used white chalk swirls to signal readiness. And in parts of Siberia, hunters painted their faces to honor the spirits of animals they hoped to catch. Scholars still debate how deeply connected these customs were. Were they born from contact coincidence or common instinct? There's no firm answer. But one thing is clear across the world: skin becomes symbol. So, as you journey through this quiet fog, remember you're not just following blue warriors. You're tracing a global tradition of painted defiance, a language written not in ink, but in courage. Step closer, and you'll hear it whispered like a dare. They fought completely naked. That single detail pulled from Roman texts clings to the Picts' reputation like dew to morning heather. But how true is it? Did these warriors truly abandon all clothing, or is something more complex or even misleading at play? Roman historians particularly, Tacitus loved painting their enemies as uncivilized extremes, savages in the forest, beast-like in behavior, alien in appearance. For them, nudity symbolized barbarism. So, when they described Picts or Britons naked and painted blue, they may have been crafting an image, not documenting a fact. After all, exaggeration was a useful political tool. Some scholars argue the naked label may have meant lightly clothed or unarmored. Woolen cloaks, linen wraps, or leather belts wouldn't have looked like proper attire to a Roman centurion in full gear. The Picts may have simply dressed differently in local styles that didn't register as clothing through the lens of Roman decorum. And then there's burial evidence. Archaeologists examining Pictish graves have found textile fragments, bronze pins, and occasional clasps, clues pointing toward garments even if rudimentary. These items don't suggest elaborate robes, but they do challenge the idea of total nudity. If warriors were buried with such items, it's likely they wore them in life, or at least in ceremony. Still, there are curious contradictions. No full suits of armor have been found in early Pictish contexts. Spears, shields, and knives, yes, but nothing like the metal panoply of Rome. This absence supports the notion that if they wore anything, it was soft, movable, and minimal. Perhaps nudity wasn't a practical necessity, but a symbolic statement. We fear nothing, not even your gaze. Interestingly, this idea finds echoes in other cultures. Gaulish warriors were also described as fighting without breeches, a detail which may have been ritual rather than literal. Nudity in this frame becomes performance an unsettling spectacle meant to unnerve opponents and display supernatural confidence. Quirks abound. One Roman account describes a painted warrior with feathers glued to his shoulders, possibly using woad as adhesive. Another mentions warriors who sang before battle naked, but wearing torques' heavy metal neck rings seen as marks of status. These details add layers to the narrative. If they were unclothed, they weren't unadorned. The body itself became the costume. Some researchers remain cautious. They suggest the naked image may have emerged from ceremonial moments, initiations, dances, or funerals later misinterpreted as battle attire. Others believe Roman artists and writers simply indulged in artistic license, mixing truth with titillation. But whether fact or fable, the image persists: blue-painted men charging bare through fog, wielding terror like a sword. Even the possibility of such warriors was enough to freeze enemy morale. So, you press on pondering not just what they wore, but what the idea of their nudity meant. Was it armor stripped away, or ego stripped bare? Either way, in the flicker of torchlight and memory, the naked Pict endures. Colors mean more than meets the eye, especially when painted on skin before battle. To the Pict's, blue wasn't just a striking choice. It may have held deep spiritual resonance connecting body, earth, and sky. In Celtic cosmology, color wasn't decorative. It was identity status, and magic rolled into one. Blue in particular seems to have carried symbolic weight across Celtic cultures. It wasn't a casual hue. The sky and sea were sacred thresholds, spaces between realms. A body covered in blue pigment might represent a bridge between the living and the other world. By wearing blue, a warrior became liminal, alive, yet not quite bound to mortal rules. Some historians suggest this symbolism wasn't just visual, but functional. Shamans and druids, for instance, were believed to wear specific colors tied to their roles. Blue may have marked not just warriors, but those connected to prophecy, protection, or sacred rites. A fighter painted blue could signal both readiness for violence and alignment with unseen forces. There's also speculation that blue denoted elevation. In later Irish traditions, elite warriors sometimes wore blue cloaks, a sign of privilege. Could this have echoed earlier, skin-deep practices among Pictish tribes? Perhaps the painted body wasn't just for shock, it was a badge of honor. One quirk that catches scholars' attention is the recurring figure of the blue god, or guardian in Celtic myth. Deities associated with war or nature sometimes appear in stories as blue-skinned or dressed in indigo robes. While not direct evidence, these tales hint at long-standing associations between the color and potency, divine or otherwise. But interpretations vary. Some researchers warn against over-assigning meaning, where none may have been fixed. Not all tribes shared the same symbols, and what was sacred in one valley might be meaningless in another. Oral traditions evolved rapidly, shaped by war weather and whim. Still, even skeptics concede that blue had presence. To Roman eyes, it was eerie. To the Picts, it may have been affirming. A way to say, "We are not yours, and we never will be." The act of painting the body may itself have been ritual. Some believe warriors gathered before battle to anoint each other, passing pigment like a sacrament. The process bound them together in purpose and belief. Blue wasn't just for show, it was an invocation. Curiously, early Christian missionaries, centuries later, struggled to convert groups who held on to body-marking practices. They called such customs pagan paints and discouraged them with sermons and scorn. But the fact that they had to try speaks volumes. Painted identity didn't vanish easily. So here you are, tracing blue through mist and memory. You begin to see it not just as color, but as language, a dialect of defiance, devotion, and ancestral pride. It lingers on stones and stories, and perhaps in you too. Because to mark the body is to claim it, and in some traditions to offer it to something greater than fear. The recipe wasn't written down, but it was passed hand to hand, nose to nose. Making woad dye was less a craft and more an ordeal. And for those painted warriors, the sting of blue on skin wasn't just symbolic, it might have burned quite literally. It started innocently enough, harvesting the Azatis tinctoria leaves at just the right moment. Not too old, not too green. They were chopped, crushed, and dried into bricks that smelled faintly of cabbage. But the real transformation came in fermentation. And that, well, it involved ingredients you wouldn't bottle in polite company. The standard method required soaking the dried leaf bricks in stale urine, sometimes aged in clay pots for days. The ammonia helped release the blue-inducing compound, but it came with a price nose-watering stench, caustic vapors, and a foul residue that stuck to everything. The resulting paste had the consistency of cold porridge and the attitude of a wasp nest. Applying it wasn't gentle. Warriors reportedly smeared it over the entire body, often mixing it with binding agents, fat, ash animal marrow, to make it cling through combat. The process could irritate the skin, cause rashes, and even create blisters if left on too long. Some modern reenactors report a tingling sensation. Others break out in hives, which raises the question, was the burn intentional? Some believe it was. Pain sharpens the senses. If the Picts used the sting of the paint to energize, to push past hesitation, then the discomfort became part of the ritual. The act of coating oneself in this rough, smelly, slightly painful mixture might have been a rite of passage in itself. You weren't ready for war until the paint bit back. There are scattered quirky mentions in medieval manuscripts of warriors screaming during application, not in agony, but as part of a group howl or chant. Perhaps the sting was timed with a vocal ritual, or maybe it just hurt and the yelling was improvisational. Others suggest the stinging paint served another function to dull the fear. If your skin burns, you focus on sensation, not on dread. Some scholars compare it to practices in other warrior cultures, like the Maasai applying irritants before initiation ceremonies, or Norse berserkers consuming mind-altering substances to deaden pain and heighten aggression. But there's no consensus. Some researchers argue that most of the discomfort was unintentional, a byproduct of primitive chemistry. They caution against romanticizing it. After all, even warriors dislike boils. Still, even skeptics admit the pigment sting might have been tolerated or embraced for reasons lost to us. One theory even proposes that some variations of woad were made to itch. Not dangerously so, but just enough to keep the wearer moving, unsettled, restless. A tactical benefit in cold climates and fast skirmishes. So, next time you imagine a blue-painted warrior, remember their skin wasn't just dyed, it might have been on fire. Not literally, but close enough to leave a mark both visible and visceral, and in that mark perhaps lay their edge. You hear it before you see it. A shrill cry cutting through mist, then silence. A second later, a blur of blue rushes from the hills. It's not just the look of the Pictish warriors that unnerved the Romans. It was the fear they conjured, weaponized like a blade sharpened in ritual, unleashed with precision. The Picts didn't fight for spectacle. They fought to disorient. Their appearance naked or near to it, smeared in an unnatural hue, screaming in what sounded like madness, was a performance meant to destabilize the enemy long before the first spear flew. And it worked. Roman soldiers trained to face predictable formations often froze, confused, even panicked. Historians call this psychological warfare when the mind is the first battlefield, and the Picts weren't alone in mastering it. Think of the Norse berserkers warriors who entered a trance-like rage, frothing at the mouth, howling like wolves. Or the Aztec jaguar warriors who donned animal skins and masks to become living predators. Even samurai occasionally used face paint or terrifying masks to project fear. Across time and cultures, the principle remains: if you can unnerve your enemy, you're halfway to victory. Pictish tactics included ambushes, sudden raids, and strange disjointed movement in battle. Combined with their painted bodies, it created an effect of unpredictability, something no army, no matter how disciplined, likes to face. It's one thing to fight a man. It's another to fight what looks like a spirit, moves like a shadow, and screams like an omen. Some accounts describe Roman units breaking rank at the first charge not due to injury, but confusion. The foggy terrain helped, the pigment helped, but fear was the true blade. One quirky Roman letter even mentions officers urging soldiers not to stare too long into their faces, as if the paint might cast a spell. Perhaps that was superstition, or maybe the Romans were just that rattled. Modern reenactors trying to replicate Pictish battle tactics often report how eerie it feels to see someone human, but not quite rush at you covered in paint and yelling in an unfamiliar tongue. Even knowing it's play acting, some say it triggers instinctive reactions: flight, hesitation, discomfort. The line between battle and theater warrior and actor was thin. Every detail, the noise, the nudity, the color, was curated for impact. A Roman soldier might know logically that blue paint doesn't make someone invincible, but in the heat of battle, logic flickers and sensation takes over. Scholars still argue, was this an intentional strategy or just cultural expression misunderstood by outsiders? Did the Picts think of themselves as terrifying or simply as themselves? No one can say for sure. The historical record is too silent. But the effect is documented and the fear was real. So, as you drift further into the smoky glens of the past, imagine standing on that field fog, thick grass, wet breath visible. And then imagine the shriek, the blur of blue, the smell of earth and sweat. No swords drawn yet, but already the fear has arrived. If you ever wonder why the painted warriors sound more like ghosts than men, the answer lies in who wrote their story. Nearly every image we have of the Picts' blue naked wild comes not from their own voices, but from their enemies, specifically from Rome. And Rome had a flair for creative nonfiction. Roman chroniclers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio described the tribes of northern Britain with a mix of fascination and disdain. They portrayed the Picts as barely human, primitive, irrational, even grotesque. Painted skin and bare bodies were just the surface. The real aim was to make these people feel alien. Easier to justify conquest when the other side barely resembles a civilization. But historians today are skeptical. They point out that Roman texts often follow a pattern: the farther from Rome, the more monstrous the description. Whether it's the tattooed Scythians, the cannibalistic Celts, or the eerie blue Picts, these tales reveal more about Roman fears than about actual practices. The trick lies in the language. Words like savage, uncivilized, and naked were used less as literal descriptors and more as markers of moral inferiority. If the enemy wore no armor, it wasn't bravery, it was foolishness. If they painted their skin, it wasn't culture, it was madness. Through this lens, blue bodies weren't impressive. They were a symptom of disorder. Some modern scholars argue that Rome used these depictions as psychological armor. By dehumanizing opponents, they made their own failures, ambush patrols, failed conquests, feel less embarrassing. We weren't beaten by soldiers, they might say. We were surprised by savages. One particularly quirky detail: Roman mosaics sometimes included blue-painted figures in battle scenes. But the pigment was often exaggerated, even comical, more Smurf than soldier. It suggests a growing mythos, one that transformed real warriors into monstrous caricatures for dinner party anecdotes and triumphal murals. Yet this distortion wasn't just political. It also shaped centuries of misunderstanding. Later, historians and even artists borrowed from Roman accounts, repeating and expanding the image. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the idea of wild blue barbarians was well established, despite little direct evidence. That's the real tragedy. The Picts left few written records. Their stories, ceremonies, and worldviews were largely oral and largely lost. What remains is filtered through enemy eyes, distorted by fear, bias, and occasional satire. Still, there are hints of complexity beneath the caricature. Roman complaints about their tactics, swift retreats, surprise attacks. Guerrilla strategy suggests a people far more organized than the label savage implies. Their use of terrain coordination and timing shows tactical awareness. The paint may have been one part of a larger, sophisticated system. So, as you sit with these ancient accounts, read them like a whisper through a cracked window. Yes, the blue warriors appear. Yes, they frighten. But ask yourself who's telling the story and what did they want you to feel? The fog of war, after all, isn't just on the battlefield. Sometimes it lives in the archives, too. Bones don't lie, but they do stay quiet. And when it comes to proving the existence of painted warriors, archaeologists have had to listen carefully to what the graves do and don't reveal. For the Picts, the burial record is a tantalizing puzzle full of silence and possibility. In northern Scotland and its surrounding isles, dozens of Pictish burial sites have been excavated. These aren't grand tombs, but simple stone-lined graves, some with personal items, others stark and bare. Many contain weapons, tools, and ornaments like torques or brooches. But so far, one thing has never been found: a body with confirmed traces of woad on the skin. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. Woad isn't permanent. Unlike tattoo ink, it sits on the surface of the skin, not inside it. And after centuries, underground pigments break down, especially if applied without binding agents. By the time archaeologists arrive, time and soil have erased most of what once clung to flesh. Still, researchers haven't given up. New forensic techniques like mass spectrometry and chemical residue analysis are being applied to old finds, hoping to detect microscopic traces of plant-based dyes. So far, the results are inconclusive. No smoking blue yet, but the hunt continues. More suggestive are the burial patterns themselves. In some graves, male skeletons are found with unusually high wear on the upper arms and shoulders, indicative of heavy repeated movement, possibly from applying pigment or wielding a weapon. Other graves include small grinding stones, sometimes interpreted as tools for preparing dyes. Coincidence, maybe, but the placement feels intentional. There are also symbols. Pictish carved stones often show abstract swirling designs. Some believe these echo body art patterns now lost to time. The repetition of spiral motifs, animals, and curvilinear shapes might be more than aesthetic. Could they be echoes of painted forms once worn in life, now translated into stone for death? One particularly quirky find came from a burial near Orkney, a skeleton surrounded by lumps of mineral pigment, not blue but red ochre. It suggests that painting the dead or being buried with dye materials had ceremonial meaning. If red was used for death, perhaps blue was reserved for life or battle. Still, skeptics point to the absence of direct evidence. If blue paint was so central, why hasn't it left a clearer trace? Why no stained bones, no dye pots in warrior graves? It's possible the rituals were communal paint prepared and shared at camp, not stored or buried. Or perhaps only certain elite warriors wore it, making its use rarer than Roman texts suggest. Some historians even argue the paint was ephemeral, on purpose meant to vanish, with the flesh leaving no trace for future eyes. A final act of secrecy from a culture already skilled in shadow and illusion. So, here you are, bent over a centuries-old grave, listening to the dirt. It doesn't speak loudly, but if you pay attention, you might just hear it murmur. There's more beneath the surface. Not every mark on the body was for war. Long before swords clashed or horns blew, pigment had another purpose: transformation. Among the Picts, as in many ancient cultures, paint was not just battle camouflage. It was a sacred thread in the rituals of life, death, and everything in between. Imagine a child's first hunt, a shaman's trance, or the quiet agony of mourning. At each threshold, the body might be altered, painted, tattooed, or even scarified to signal a shift. You weren't the same person afterward. The skin told others what had changed. Evidence for this in Pictish culture is fragile but suggestive. Stone carvings and figurines show human forms marked with dots, lines, and swirling shapes. Some scholars interpret these as body art patterns, visual records of rites that involve pigment or incision. Others caution that these might be symbolic, not literal. The truth has always remained smudged. Still parallels abound. Celtic tribes across Europe are known to have practiced symbolic body marking. The Gauls tattooed their skins possibly with plant-based inks. Irish texts describe rituals involving dyes applied during marriage ceremonies or initiation rites. Could the Picts have shared these traditions? It seems likely. One particularly curious possibility is that woad, the same plant used in war paint, was also used in spiritual ceremonies. Some sources suggest it may have been applied during healing rituals, its sting and scent believed to drive out illness or bad spirits. Others propose it marked the body during trance work when shamans or seers entered altered states of consciousness. Christian missionaries arriving centuries later were deeply unsettled by these customs. They denounced body markings as pagan, even devilish. Yet their complaints are often the only written record of such traditions. In their scolding, we find clues references to colored skin, ritual ink, and unclean daubings that suggest a complex ceremonial culture now largely vanished. One quirky detail in some parts of Scotland folk tales persisted well into the 18th century. About blue blessings, a line of pigment drawn across a baby's brow to protect against spirits. It's not proof of continuity, but it hints at echoes that stretch deep. Modern experimental archaeologists and biohackers have tried to recreate possible ritual dyes, blending woad with honey ash or plant oils. Some formulas sting, others soothe. One group found that a mix of woad and birch resin created a semi-permanent tattoo, faint bluish and resistant to washing, a ghost mark, like memory on the skin. But debates persist. Some scholars insist the ceremonial uses of woad are overblown romantic projections onto a poorly understood people. Others argue that when written records are absent, we must read the margins, the stones, the myths, the discomfort of those who tried to suppress the practice. So, tonight you trace your fingers through invisible lines, paint that once blessed, protected, or initiated. You see warriors not just as fighters, but as vessels of something deeper. The skin was more than surface. It was a script, a ceremony, a belief system painted in strokes we're still trying to decipher. And then, just like that, the blue men vanish. No grand battle, no epic collapse, just silence. After centuries of haunting Rome's northern frontier of painting fear into the fog, the Picts begin to fade from the record. One moment they're terrifying painted warriors. The next, merged absorbed or simply gone. Historians call this the Pictish disappearance. Around the 9th century, written references to the Picts declined sharply. By the 10th, they're barely mentioned at all. No more blue warriors, no more tribal kings, no more ominous fog. Instead, we hear about the emerging kingdom of Alba, what would later become Scotland. What happened? One theory is cultural absorption. Over time, the Picts intermarried with the Gaels from Dal Riata, a neighboring kingdom to the west. Gaelic culture, language, and political systems began to dominate. The warrior scribes of the Gaels had writing. The Picts didn't. In history, the pen doesn't just write the future, it erases the past. Another possibility is Christianization. As monastic influence spread through the highlands, old customs faded. Painting the body, celebrating warrior rites, practicing pagan ceremonies, these became not just unfashionable, but forbidden. With conversion came conformity, and the painted people quietly laid down their pigments. Still others point to Viking incursions. Raids along the eastern coast shattered Pictish strongholds, disrupted trade, and disbanded local power. Though the Picts fought back, the damage was lasting. their political cohesion frayed, their leaders killed or displaced. A culture under siege finds little time for ritual paint. And yet, they didn't completely vanish. Genetic studies show that modern Scots share DNA markers with ancient Pictish remains. Place names across northeast Scotland still echo their language. Some carved stones swirls beasts. Warriors remain defiantly upright in fields and churchyards, silent, but unmistakably Pictish. One quirky example, the Maiden Stone near Inverurie, a tall, weathered slab with carvings of mythical creatures and what some believe to be a veiled woman. Legend says she was turned to stone after losing a wager with the devil, but scholars suspect she's a remnant of Pictish myth, now wrapped in Christian story. So, perhaps they didn't disappear, perhaps they were renamed. Some historians believe Pict was a Roman invention, a label used for convenience. When Rome left and new powers rose, the old name lost meaning. The people remained, but under new identities, Gaels, Scots, Highlanders. Culture is slippery like that. It doesn't die, it transforms. There's no scholarly consensus on the Pictish end. Was it a fade or a fall, a choice or a conquest? The records are murky, the evidence scattered, but the silence is loud. Tonight, as you wander these quiet highlands in your mind, you might picture the last blue warrior, not defeated, but forgotten, his pigment washed away by rain, his story rewritten by others. But listen closely. In the rustle of heather and the stones left behind in the very soil, they're still here. Not gone, just painted into history's background. Curiosity, it seems, doesn't die with time. It just gets itchier. In recent decades, a curious blend of reenactors, historians, and self-proclaimed woad warriors have taken it upon themselves to revive the look and lore of the painted Picts. And their efforts have led to some surprising discoveries. You might picture academic conferences and dusty books, but modern woad experimentation often looks more like backyard alchemy. Enthusiasts harvest Izatus tinctoria, fermented in buckets of stale urine, true to ancient technique, and then slather the resulting goo onto their skin. For history, of course, not fashion, and the results mixed, to put it kindly. One group reported an unexpected issue: the smell. Fermented woad is not gentle. It clings to skin like wet mold and makes your neighbors reconsider their life choices. Several participants described it as eye-watering barnyard adjacent and something between old fish and regret. Then there's the itch. Even with careful preparation, the dye often causes skin irritation, rashes, hives, or in one particularly enthusiastic case, a full-body red bloom that required antihistamines and a cold bath. Turns out our ancestors may have had sturdier skin, or simply suffered in stoic silence. But not all experiments end in discomfort. Some reenactors have found that adding animal fat beeswax or even egg whites to the mixture helps stabilize the pigment and reduce irritation. The resulting blue is deeper, more vibrant, and more resistant to sweat. A few have even managed to go full-picked barefoot blue and ready for battle reenactments in the Scottish Highlands, weather permitting. These modern trials have illuminated forgotten details. For example, one researcher discovered that layering woad over a base of charcoal created a more dramatic visual contrast and offered mild sun protection. Others found that applying the paint in specific patterns across muscles enhanced perceived movement and bulk. It wasn't just paint, it was illusion. Quirkier still, some biohackers have tried to isolate woad's compounds for use in modern products. One team proposed using it in antimicrobial dressings, reviving its rumored ancient healing properties. Another tried mixing it into tattoo ink, not quite successful, but blue enough to raise eyebrows at the local parlor. Despite the occasional rash and ruined t-shirt, most participants agree on one thing: the experience feels transformative. To smear your skin with an ancient dye to walk into the woods as blue as the sky, it shifts something. Not just in how you look, but in how you think. You feel the distance from the modern world. You feel the mystery of what came before. Of course, there's no scholarly consensus on whether these experiments tell us anything definitive. Some argue they're just cosplay with a historical twist. Others believe such embodied trials offer insight into sensations, challenges, and meanings that written records can't convey. Either way, it proves one thing: the blue body still calls to us. Across centuries and science fairs, it refuses to be forgotten. Even if now and then it itches like mad. Blue skin, wind-blown hair, primal screams. That's how Hollywood likes its warriors. But somewhere between history and high definition, the painted fighters of the past have taken on new roles: movie stars, comic book villains, video game avatars. The pics may have vanished from the archives, but in popular culture they're practically immortal. Take Braveheart, for instance. Mel Gibson's rendition of William Wallace sports a face streaked in bright blue, woad, furious, fearless, and fictional. While striking on screen, it's not exactly accurate. Wallace was born centuries after the last recorded use of Pictish war paint, and there's no evidence he or his men ever dabbled in pigment. But that didn't stop the imagery from sticking. Since then, the Blue Warrior has become a cinematic shorthand, tribal, untamed, emotionally raw. You see echoes in fantasy films, too. Think of the Na'vi in Avatar, or the Dothraki's stylized war aesthetics in Game of Thrones. The body becomes a billboard for intensity, rebellion, otherness. Why does this image resonate so deeply? Some say it taps into a cultural longing for rawness, an idea of warriors unburdened by modern armor or bureaucracy. The blue skin signals a return to instinct, to earth, to something elemental. Others argue it's pure fantasy, the appeal of the exotic filtered through a Western gaze. After all, few of these portrayals aim for accuracy. In video games, the trend continues. Characters inspired by Celtic or barbarian archetypes often appear painted shirtless and wild-eyed. Games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice lean heavily on Pictish and Norse motifs. The visuals are stunning, but the history is smudged, if not entirely rewritten. One quirky example. A popular toy line once released Celtic warrior Barbie, complete with blue face paint and faux leather armor. It sold surprisingly well. Historians, unsurprisingly, are divided. Some see these portrayals as useful gateways, hooks, that draw audiences into deeper learning. A blue-painted Wallace may be wrong, but if it sparks curiosity about the pics, is that so bad? Others argue that distortions like this flatten complex cultures into cliches. The danger isn't paint on the wrong person, it's losing the person altogether. Interestingly, some modern Scots embrace the trope. At Highland Games and festivals, it's not uncommon to see blue-painted competitors and performers. They do it knowingly, blending celebration and satire. The image may be inaccurate, but it's also theirs now. Still, the trope raises questions. When does representation become myth? When does inspiration turn into erasure? And what exactly do we lose when pigment becomes parody? There's no firm answer. But one thing is certain: the painted warrior has become more than a historical figure. He's an icon, a symbol, a fantasy dressed in woad and wielding a borrowed sword. So, next time you see blue on screen, ask yourself, are you looking at the past or at our modern fascination with the idea of what the past ought to be? Either way, the pigment persists on skin in cinema and in our restless imaginations. Paint doesn't last, but the stories it stains into memory do. And somehow, the image of a warrior bare and blue still lingers across the centuries. You see it in art, in reenactments, in history books, sometimes accurate, often not. But the idea sticks. Why? Maybe it's because the painted body breaks rules. It challenges our sense of what's normal, safe, civilized. It flips the script instead of armor pigment, instead of silence, a war cry, instead of blending in boldness. To wear blue into battle is to reject invisibility. And that kind of defiance resonates far beyond any single tribe or century. The Picts didn't leave us books or scrolls. Their language has been lost, their gods unnamed, but their image striking, surreal, unsettling remains vivid. The blue body becomes a placeholder for all that we can't quite define: mystery, rebellion, the edge between man and myth. Some scholars say that's the real legacy. Not the pigment itself, but what it represents. In a world of empire and order, the painted warrior stood apart. He wasn't trying to impress Rome or fit into its idea of civilization. He was his own message. His body spoke for him, loud, strange, unforgettable. Even today, that symbolism holds power. Artists use body paint to explore identity. Protesters smear themselves in color to demand visibility. Festivals revive ancient pigments as a celebration of cultural roots. Each echo carries the spirit of the original act. This is who I am, and you will not look away. There's even a quirky urban legend that resurfaces now, and then a Scottish biker gang rumored to paint themselves blue before rallies. No proof, of course, but it speaks to something deeper, a longing to feel wild, untamed, elemental. Like the Picts, but with leather jackets instead of spears. And yet the history is more than rebellion. It's also beauty, ritual, connection. To paint the body isn't just to fight. It's to mark a moment, a passage, a belief. The blue wasn't only fearsome, it was sacred. Modern historians still argue over the details. Was woad really used? Were they truly naked? Did the paint burn? The evidence is partial. The answer's blurry. But maybe that's fitting. The blue itself was never meant to last. It was meant to shimmer, to startle, to disappear, with the warrior into mist. So tonight, as the world quiets around you, let the last traces of pigment settle. The fog rolls in, the field empties. But somewhere just out of sight, you sense them, a flicker of color, a breath of defiance, a story painted not on skin, but on time itself. And if it fades, that's all right. What matters is that it was seen. Now the blue fades gently from the skin, like twilight easing into night. The echo of war cries has softened into the rustle of grass, and the painted warriors, so fierce, so strange, slip back into legend where they belong. You've wandered their paths, felt the sting of their paint, and seen the world through the fog they used like a veil. What lingers now isn't fear, but fascination. The quiet knowledge that even in silence stories endure. That color can be armor. That identity can be inked into history with no parchment at all. So, rest now, traveler. Let your thoughts drift like mist over moorland, quiet and unhurried. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there, and which forgotten culture or strange custom would you like to visit next?